someone who has a auditory taste synesthesia might hear my voice and get the sensation of chocolate in their mouth, where that would be very pleasant, but it could also be something unpleasant.
Synesthesia. It's where the senses come together in ways most of us can't even imagine. Colors become sounds, words have tastes, and the lines between different senses blur. How does this all tie into neurodiversity? What does synesthesia look like? And is it possible that you might be experiencing it without even realizing it? Our guest, Maike Preißing, is with us to help explore the connections that make synesthesia so unique. That's straight ahead on episode 185. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism Spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Don't forget that the Executive Function Online Summit, also known as TEFOS, kicks off this weekend. Seth Perler has done an amazing job of curating a list of experts to talk about how you can support your child or teen to develop the executive function skills they need to be successful. The event is free all weekend long, and you can register through the link in the show notes. If you can't attend live, but you want to make sure that you don't miss out on any of the information or bonuses, you can purchase an all-access pass and have lifelong access to all of the resources included. Just check the show notes for the link. Okay, my conversation with Maike Preißing is up next.
When I found the Neurodiversity podcast, I was really kind of
desperate to learn about myself and understand myself.
Honestly, I wanted to find like a
tribe who I could relate to and feel like I fit in.
This podcast brings on guests who seem to be moving neurodiversity more
into the mainstream. And Emily Kircher-Morris is amazing.
I feel like she's talking straight to me.
Her knowledge about people who think differently is so refreshing. Everyone's different.
And the world needs to
understand them. And that's what the Neurodiversity
podcast is doing.
Helping them understand
us.
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 Us. Us.
Our guest today is Maike Preißing. Maike is a neurodivergent psychologist from Germany. She also has a podcast that focuses on her area of specialization called Let's Talk Synesthesia. I'm going to have trouble saying this. Say it for me, please, Maike.
Hi, Emily. Hi, everybody. It's synesthesia.
We did an episode on dyscalculia. That was another one I had a hard time.
Same. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. So some of our listeners might be familiar with the concept of synesthesia, but it might be new to some others. And I believe that in order to give our listeners an idea of what synesthesia is, you kind of have some questions that maybe can help people reflect on their own experiences to see if maybe they have experienced this. So let's just jump right in right there.
Exactly. Yeah. Synesthesia is just not very well known because it's not like a pathology, so you wouldn't find it in any diagnostic manual. And that's also why we don't hear a lot about it. Rightfully so. It's not a pathology, but still, yeah, I think we have to talk about it more. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to share more about synesthesia.
Yeah, definitely.
I wrote down a couple questions for you and also for the audience to just look inwards for a second and realize if there might be some synesthesia. And also if we don't find synesthesia in ourselves because it is a rare trait, it might help us to get an idea of what it's like. And when we work with kids or we have kids at home, it just helps us to understand what's like that huge spectrum of synesthesia forms, what they could look like. So one of the questions would be, if you think of the letter F, what do you see? What color do you see? Does it have a gender, a personality? Does it maybe have a relationship with another letter? It might be in a romantic relationship with the letter M, even though that sounds a bit silly, but that's just the case for many people. Or maybe the letter H or the letter A, whatever comes up. For me, the letter A is immediately red. There's no room for discussion. Also numbers, like the number 7 or the number 500 might have a specific color or gender or personality. Another form would be anything auditory. So you hear my voice, you hear a sound or your favorite song, and you associate colors, shapes, form, or even a taste with it. So someone who has a auditory taste synesthesia might hear my voice and get the sensation of chocolate in their mouth, where that would be very pleasant, but it could also be something unpleasant. Another question would be, if you watch a movie, for example, and you see someone being hurt or shot, do you feel that sensation in your own body? Maybe at your workplace, someone touches someone else's shoulder and you feel that on your own shoulder, like you are being touched. Synesthetes also often connect a personality, like if you think about your sister or your best friend, and you immediately see a color associated with them, that might be another form. Maybe it's a taste again, or a shape, or you connect a person with a number, could also be the case. And then another form, which is again very different, but when you hear me speaking, or when you're speaking yourself, or you have a thought, you see that written out like subtitles in your mind's eye. That's another form I have, and it's often forgotten because it doesn't have that sensory connection. But if you see the words written out while I'm speaking, we might be in the synesthesia spectrum.
Wow. That's a lot of different areas. I mean, I'm sure there are probably others as well. Here's one thing that I do, and I often get, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but I get letters and numbers mixed up.
Yeah.
I don't know how to explain it, but they're just like, they're parallel. They have matches.
Yeah.
Like, here's an example. So I don't know that many of our audience members probably know this, but coming out of high school, I was actually supposed to go into the Air Force. I was going to be a cryptologic linguist.
Wow.
Yes, words and decoding things and different things. But we went and visited one of the Air Force bases, and I actually don't even remember what it was, but in the military, they always have lots of like letters and numbers that represent different things. And so I was saying something about the type of store, which had a letter or a number associated with it, but I was flipping it. And my recruiter was talking, and he's like, "What are you talking about?" Like, I had no idea. And it was kind of the first time that I really realized that I constantly am doing that. I don't know. Is that just me being weird?
Well, that's not weird at all. Do you remember any of the matches? Is it like M and 7? Do you remember any of them?
Yeah. 4 is F. N is 11.
That's so interesting. I love that. I think, so I would suspect that there is an underlying logic. If you don't connect them over the color, because that's for me, like 4 and F are very similar because they are dark blue. So can relate to that. It's one of my worst anxieties to read out a phone number because I will do exactly what you just described. That's a bit embarrassing. Yeah, so I can relate to that. If you don't have the colors, I've never heard of anybody describing it, but I'm 100% sure you're not alone. There's something else, which I saw online quite a lot, where people say Thursday, 8 p.m. and October are the same.
Interesting. I'm going to have to analyze this a little bit more because I really don't think about it consciously all that much. But I actually wonder if there's something about the sound of the, like, 4 and F, obviously there's like, that's kind of part of it. But then even N with 11, like there's kind of that, I don't know. I'm going to have to reflect on this a little bit more, but this is fascinating to me.
It is. It's endlessly fascinating.
Yes.
If we look at the word synesthesia, it comes from the ancient Greek word syn for together and aesthesis. I never know how to say it in English. Aesthesis for sensation. So synesthesia describes merged senses, experiencing senses, like the union of the senses, kind of.
Interesting.
So it is a neurological trait, just a trait, like a norm variant. It occurs in around 4.4% of the population. It's a lot higher in autistic people. And it comes down to like minor differences in brain connectivity. That doesn't mean it's just overly connected. It can also be in some areas underconnected. It's just a different kind of connectivity, which leads to when we get one stimulus, that could be a sound just an auditory stimulus and the brain of a synesthete, especially like an auditory synesthete, that brain would react with two responses. And that's the extraordinary part about it. Like we hear something and the hearing part of our brain is activated, but we also get, for example, the visual or the taste area of the brain activated. We can actually see that on a brain scan. So it's very well studied today. It's valid. There's no doubt it exists. It's nothing spooky or to sound fancy. It's a real thing, a real human experience, and it's quite well studied. But again, it's the brain. So we know a lot, and at the same time, we know nothing at all.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the other ways that synesthesia impacts your daily life?
So for me personally, I spoke to another synesthete and scientist the other week, and he described it more. So we talk about forms, and I would count like the forms I have and then add up to like 17 different forms or so, which still feels a bit like mechanical and artificial, because what it actually is for me in daily life is that most of the sensations I experience, like a sound, touch, pain, wherever in my body it is, it could be, a stomach cramp or having sore muscles from working out. All of that is immediately translated into a color and shapes and forms. And that just happens constantly. And it's not good or bad, but I did realize over the last 2 years where I really gained all of that expertise and started to podcast on synesthesia, I really, really understood how much it does impact one's mental health and how it is part of the problem when we struggle, but it's definitely part of the solution. Once we speak about perception and talk about the nuances of our perception, it gets so much easier to develop those strategies to, when I go to a concert, it can be quite overwhelming to not only hear the music on stage, but to also see the music. And not only that, but also to see, the people talking, just a general concert noise that comes on top. And then I'm not very tall, so I also get a lot of elbows and there's a lot of touch, a lot of sound, and all of that is, of course, has this second layer of color and shapes. That's quite a lot to digest.
Yeah, so you're experiencing the visual stimuli of the concert and the lights and everything itself, but then layered on top of that, you're also having the sound that you're hearing, but it's also providing visual input to your brain at the same time as the other things that you're seeing.
Exactly. And it can be absolutely beautiful. I wouldn't trade my synesthesia for anything. And that's really what most synesthetes say. But it's exactly that. It just you just have to digest more information. And that can just be really tiring. Or I think you have to go into it with more capacity because, there's a lot going on. It's a busy brain.
Well, and I can think about just in general for people who have other sensory sensitivities, that overwhelm, that experience, it can be probably just a lot to try to focus on one particular thing or tune some of those things out.
Right. It can be really difficult. And it's very difficult also to understand what is synesthesia and what is having autistic traits, what is having sensory sensitivities. Because, of course, because I have all those sensitivities, also the synesthesia is a lot stronger. Mm-hmm. If I would have more of an average, if sound wouldn't be overwhelming to me, maybe I could handle anything else also a lot better. Mm-hmm. But since I'm sensitive and it's translated to a color, it is just a lot. And you really have to manage your capacities. And don't want to speak for everybody. I think for a lot of people, it's not a problem at all. And it's just a nice top on. A lot of people talk about it like it is a superpower, which is not really my approach to it. I think it really is just a norm variant, and we have to talk more about perception.
Yeah.
The stories I hear are very, very personal and vulnerable because it's so personal.
I'm sure that, like everything, this is kind of a a spectrum, right? From people who are less impacted to more impacted. Like I'm thinking you were mentioning the things about days of the week. And I remember a friend who was very assertive about the fact that different colors were associated with different days of the week. And she would always wear those particular colors like in her clothing on that day of the week because that's just what you had to do. That's just how she just felt really strongly about that.
Yeah.
But for people who experience synesthesia, how does it impact them when they have to explain that to other people in the world who don't understand or know about it? Especially for kids maybe who don't have the language and the adults who maybe are just unaware and it's like don't really know what they're really talking about when they try to explain it.
Absolutely. So that really is my main focus. I think it's so incredibly important that we listen to children and like believe them when they say they don't want to interact with the number 5, for example, because the number 5 is a bully. Like that sounds silly, right? Why would a kid say that? Don't be difficult. Well, you will have to get over it. For someone who has, it's called ordinal linguistic personification, where numbers and letters have a personality. The world is so much more social. Like every letter and every word and number has a personality and I interact with it. Even though it sounds crazy for many people, it's not crazy at all. It's fairly common. And exactly like you said, kids would express it in child language. And then it really is on us adults to react appropriately. And that's what we're trying to do. Also, we had the first Synesthesia Awareness Day in July, just to raise awareness for healthcare professionals, parents, teachers, to know that it is out there. It is a thing, and you don't have to know anything about it because it's extremely complex and also very different for everybody. But it's just really important that we then just take it seriously and go online, because now there are a lot of resources. There are great books, TED Talks. There's my podcast.
Yeah.
But there's just so much more than, for example, when my mom tried to figure it out 20 years ago for myself. So a lot of kids heard and still hear, shut up about it. You will have to be put in a clinic if you talk about stuff like that, or you're wrong, or you're making it up.
Yeah.
And that's really harmful because it really trains you to have this censoring process, right? You hear that it's a negative thing, so you're not gonna give it more attention. It's still going on. Your brain is still producing that connection every living minute of when you're in school, but you're trained to not talk about it, so you also don't give it attention. And I think that can be quite harmful. We have that perception, maybe more as a kid, and then we are trying to not talk about it and not pay attention. And I think that really will affect us long term.
Yeah.
Some of us.
I remember reading an article one time, and it was discussing the fact that at a certain time, there were a lot of children who experienced the colors associated with letters. And when they did this research, you know those little blocks, those little wooden blocks that have the letters on them with the colors? And this was just a very popular toy at this time. I don't know if it was like the early 80s or something like that. But a bunch of kids all at once had the same colors for these letters that were aligned with this toy. Are we aware of anything that can kind of not cause those ties, but like if somebody is predisposed perhaps to synesthesia, is it some of those outside influences that then create some of those ties for them?
So I think that's a topic we don't have an answer to that yet. We're highly interested in finding out how that works. Why do we think certain letters have certain colors? The letter A, for example, really is for the majority of people is red. So how can that be almost universal? It's not universal at all, but you know.
Right.
Of course, there's a lot of conversation around what is the reason for me thinking about the word community and having the word, the taste of yogurt in my mouth. What's the connection? When did I eat yogurt for the first time? Was it maybe also the time where I heard the word community the first time? Could be, but it's also at the same time we see how random it is. And especially for sequence-based synesthesia, where the question of how you see the year, for example, if I ask you to imagine the year, for some people it's a calendar. For some, it's a time beam or a circle. But then for others, it's like this very weird, unique shape of like a go-kart racetrack thing that really just goes in a very unique shape. And you can be so certain that this kid was never shown that kind of shape to understand the year.
Right.
Whereas a calendar, we could think, yeah, well, we just saw a calendar a lot. But there are so many unique connections that, yeah, there is no definite answer to it. There must be some maybe conditioning process for some forms, and then for others, not at all. It's really interesting, but there's no real answer to it yet. What we do know is it is genetic. It does run in families for a fact. But it's also very interesting that only the genetic disposition for synesthesia is inherited, but not the form. So your dad might have auditory visual synesthesia and you have a completely different form.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is still a lot to to discover, but that's a really good question, yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of people who are autistic experienced synesthesia. Is that primarily where we might see some of this? What is some of the information that we have about that?
So what we do know is that synesthesia is higher in autistic people compared to the general population. I spoke to Professor Jules Simner, who is a synesthesia expert and researcher in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Sussex, and she said there is no evidence yet to show that synesthesia and ADHD overlap. But she also said it would not be surprising at all if someone finds evidence next week, because we know like autism traits and ADHD traits cluster together, and then also synesthesia and autism clusters together. So it's quite likely that other neurodiversities also have an increased number of synesthetes. Anxiety disorder as well. We know there is evidence that anxiety disorder and synesthesia have a connection. Memory and creativity is higher for synesthetes as well.
You mentioned that sometimes letters, for example, have like a personality. You know how there are certain words that people have like a very like visceral emotional reaction to? Is that a type, or is that similar, or is that kind of outside of that?
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, here's one that came to mind is there are a lot of people who have very, very strong feelings about the word moist.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think that wouldn't qualify as a form of synesthesia, I think. But there are definitely still forms that provoke an emotion or a texture, for example. Wearing jeans, for example, or having to touch microfiber.
Let me ask you this, so as a psychologist, and you're supporting individuals who experience synesthesia, what are some of the things that you do to help them? What are some of the things that they commonly need support with?
When synesthetes come to me because they look for help, for coaching, I see a lot of, it just needs a safe space, honestly. It needs a place where people can dip their toe into, that's the way I perceive the world. Isn't that so crazy? And then I'm like, that's not crazy at all. Like, you're not alone with that at all. I heard that before. It makes sense. Look, that's what we know about the brain. And from there, this beautiful process of opening up even more. And this sensor that I spoke about earlier starts to, the curtains disappear. Now I'm translating German sayings, I think. But it's allowing them to talk about it without feeling crazy or judged, and really embracing their perception rather than feeling weird about it. And then also seeing how is that connected to me being tired and overwhelmed, and why do I feel so burned out? Other people can do it too. So we look a lot at like sensory sensitivities and other neurodivergent traits, and how do they also have a synesthetic layer. And then especially the mirror touch synesthesia that I mentioned before, when you see people on TV being shot and you experience that in your own body, like that's a whole nother problem. Even though it can be beautiful to have that, because it's like really this enhanced form of empathy. Like that's a lot. especially as a kid, to feel other people's pain and also to think that everybody feels everybody's pain, but people seem so unbothered by it. So of course you will assume that you are weak, right? You can't handle it. You can't watch horror movies, but the other people can. How can they have so much physical pain and still sit on their sofa, whereas you want to leave the room every time? And that, again, influences a lot our career choices, our partner choices. Is a partner that does like very risky sports where they injure themselves a lot, is that the right choice? Because that person will come home with a cast, with a broken nose, and you will feel that exact pain in your body. So yeah, it's a lot about how does synesthesia influence your life choices and just getting aware of it so we can make them more intuitively rather than like looking back and be like, I don't understand myself at all.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Maike, this has been such a fascinating conversation. And I know I could sit here and talk to you about this all day. But as we wrap up our talk, if there was a message that you could give to the world about people who experience synesthesia to help them understand this different type of mind, what would you want them to hear? What's the one thing that you would feel like is just really important for people to know?
I think community is everything. I think connecting with their Facebook groups, there are books, podcasts, their Instagram accounts where you can just see videos and reels about other people talking about their synesthesia. And it's one of those things where we walk through life and we could even be 60 or 70 and be like, oh my God, not everybody sees color when they hear music. Like, I think that's the most common experienced amongst all of us, that we have this moment where we're like, oh wow, not everybody sees the world like we do. And community is, I think, just everything, because we will understand each other or ourselves. We will understand ourselves so much better when we hear other stories. And yeah, be curious. Don't judge yourself. Try to not censor you, because the human brain is beautiful the way it is.
Maike Preißing, psychologist and host of the Let's Talk Synesthesia podcast. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
I love that there are so many areas about how our brains work that are still in the beginning stages of our understanding. It's fascinating the way our brains process information and sometimes get wires crossed in ways that can be beautiful, but sometimes also stressful. The greater our awareness and understanding of these topics, the more empathy we can have for all people who experience the world differently than ourselves. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity podcast.
Hey, our big thanks again to Maike Preißing. If you want more info about her podcast, and what she knows about synesthesia, check the show notes for links. As we get ready for school to start in the U.S., we have been preparing an online community for educators. It will launch soon, and we'll have more details here and on our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. Click the link in the show notes to get on the list and be part of it. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us here, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.